Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly massive transformation. We're going to look at how a rebellious, struggling student somehow evolved into one of the 20th century's most iconic global leaders. You know, when we think of Winston Churchill, we almost always picture that stoic, cigar-smoking prime minister holding Britain together during the absolute darkest days of the Second World War. But how did he actually get there? Let's dive right into the origin story of the Roaring Lion.
So who exactly was Winston Churchill before the World Wars hit? Well, long before he was that unyielding statesman, Churchill was a young, restless, and frankly incredibly ambitious cavalry officer. He was a guy absolutely desperate to make his mark on the world. And he saw two clear paths to pull that off: combat and journalism. His youth was essentially one giant, high-stakes adventure designed to build a rock-solid reputation.
Let's start by looking at Part 1, Aristocratic Roots and Struggles.
Churchill was born in 1874 at the Grand Blenheim Palace into the wealthy aristocratic Spencer family. But he was really the product of two very different worlds. On one side, you had his dad, Lord Randolph Churchill, a prominent British aristocrat and conservative MP. And on the other, his mom, Jenny Tyrone, the daughter of a wealthy American businessman. But here's the kicker. Despite all of that incredible privilege, Winston experienced a deeply estranged family life. His parents were just largely absent, which left young Winston to navigate his early years without much parental guidance at all.
So who actually raised him? Well, upon the death of his nanny, Elizabeth Everest, in 1895, Churchill wrote that she had been his dearest and most intimate friend during the whole of the 20 years he had lived. Raised largely by her, young Winston was, surprisingly enough, a pretty terrible student with a solid record of bad behavior. He bounced around between boarding schools and just wasn't considered academic. In fact, his father pushed him toward a military career, but Winston twice failed his entrance exams to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst before he finally scraped his way in.
Moving right along to Part 2, Soldier, Writer, and Scholar.
It's honestly breathtaking how fast this guy moved. After finally being commissioned as a cavalry cadet in 1895, Churchill actively leveraged his mother's high society connections to aggressively chase deployments in active war zones. Just look at this timeline. From his base at Aldershot, he went straight to observe the Cuban War of Independence in October 1895. By October 1896, he was out with the Hussars in India, and by September 1898, he'd somehow managed to get attached to a military campaign in the Sudan. But he wasn't just fighting out there, he was writing. He acted as a war correspondent, actively hunting down combat and journalistic opportunities just to get his name splashed across the London papers.
But India is where his mind truly leveled up. Realizing his academic shortcomings from his school days, Churchill took matters completely into his own hands in an incredible feat of self-improvement. While stationed in Bangalore, he launched this voracious self-education project. He actually had his mother ship him heavy crates of books. We're talking heavyweights like Plato, Edward Gibbon, and Charles Darwin. He studied the historian Thomas Babington Macaulay. And to really master the political landscape, he aggressively digested the Annual Register, which was a dense political almanac. He was literally giving himself the university education he never had.
During this massive intellectual awakening, his worldview shifted dramatically. He went through an intensely agnostic, almost anti-Christian phase, where he famously dismissed religion as a delicious narcotic. Interestingly, though, he did note a preference for Protestantism over Catholicism, simply because he felt it was a step nearer reason. It really gives you a picture of a young guy fiercely trying to rationalize the entire world strictly on his own terms.
But, all this intense drive came with a pretty heavy cost. Churchill suffered from a recurring major depressive disorder, which was a condition he famously called his black dog. To fend off the immense mental toll of that depression, he turned obsessively to writing. It became his ultimate safeguard. He penned military dispatches, historical books like the story of the Malakand Field Force, and even his one and only novel, which was a Ruritanian romance called Savonarola. Writing kept his mind occupied and basically kept the black dog at bay.
Now fast forward to the Sudan in 1898, and an amazing contrast in his character starts to emerge. On one hand, you've got this eager young subaltern participating in a thrilling, highly dangerous cavalry charge at the Battle of Omdurman with the 21st Lancers. But on the other hand, you have a critical journalist who openly challenged his very own commander, General Herbert Kitchener, over unmerciful tactics and the desecration of an enemy tomb. Yes, he was a soldier, but his fiercely independent mind absolutely refused to just blindly toe the line.
Which perfectly sets up Part 3 of our explainer, The Great Escape.
By 1899, Churchill had actually resigned from the regular army because he wanted to pursue politics, but he accurately anticipated the outbreak of the Second Boer War. Working as a highly paid journalist for the Morning Post, he sailed down to South Africa and charged straight into the conflict zone near the besieged town of Ladysmith. He fully understood the historical weight of this conflict and knew with sheer audacity that he just had to be right in the middle of the action. What happened next is quite literally out of an action movie. His armored train was heavily shelled and derailed by Boer artillery at Chivli. Despite fierce protests that he was just a journalist, a claim completely invalidated by the fact that he was carrying a revolver at the time, he was captured and interned as a prisoner of war in Pretoria. And then, incredibly, he executed a daring, stealthy escape. He evaded his captors by stowing away on freight trains and hiding deep inside a coal mine, eventually making it across the border to safety in Portuguese East Africa. That wild escape made him an international sensation overnight. But he wasn't done yet. He briefly rejoined the fight as a lieutenant and then spectacularly captured 52 Boer prison camp guards in Pretoria alongside his cousin, the Duke of Marlborough. The young man who was so desperate for fame had finally secured it on a massive global scale. But again, he completely surprises us. While he fought fiercely, he also urged the British public, who at the time harbored strong anti-Boer prejudices, to treat the defeated enemy with generosity and tolerance rather than vengeance. It's just a remarkable display of political maturity from a guy who was still only in his mid-20s.
This brings us to part 4, entering the political arena.
Leveraging all of that massive publicity from his POW escape and his best-selling book about the whole experience, he stood as a conservative candidate. In the October 1900 general election, he secured a narrow victory in the Oldham constituency, meaning he officially became a member of parliament at just 25 years old. However, Churchill was never someone you could easily put into a box. Even while campaigning as a conservative, he openly referred to himself as a conservative and a Tory Democrat. Privately, he went even further, declaring himself a liberal in all but name, except for his strict opposition to Irish Home Rule. It showed early signs of a fiercely independent political streak. For instance, he supported secular education but opposed women's suffrage at the time. He was just a deeply complex mix of reformist and conservative ideas.
Now here's a wild logistical detail you might not know. Members of Parliament were completely unpaid at this time in Britain, zero salary. So to fund his political career and support his lavish lifestyle in London's Mayfair, he really had to capitalize on his fame. He published Ian Hamilton's March, which chronicled his later South African experiences, and launched this massive, highly lucrative international lecture tour across Britain, the US, and Canada. During this tour, he rubbed shoulders with global titans, meeting figures like Mark Twain, President William McKinley, and Theodore Roosevelt, who, interestingly enough, he totally clashed with.
So looking back at the source material for this explainer, you really have to wonder, how much of the unyielding WWII leader was actually forged in the fires of this rebellious, action-packed youth? Could that aristocratic, failing student have ever saved Britain if he hadn't first thrown himself into the battlefields, the lonely books in India, and the prison camps? It really leaves us to question, how do our own early failures and wild ambitions shape who we ultimately become? Thanks so much for joining us. Keep questioning and keep learning.